Welcome to History Nestware. The past whispers you to sleep. The sound of footsteps reverberating down stone hallways wakes you up, getting louder and more urgent. Rough wool blankets that smell of mildew and other neglect are clutched by your tiny hands. Vienna at dawn in 1793 AD, seen via a small window. However, this forgotten tower room in the Habsburg Palace is never exposed to sunlight. No one has informed you that you are 7 years old. Since no one talks to the child they've stashed away, nobody has told you anything at all. You were born into the family of Emperor Leopold II, and your name was Ferdinand, if anyone remembers. However, if the intellect behind those noble characteristics functions differently than others anticipate, names are irrelevant in this peaceful graveyard for the living, where aristocratic blood has no significance. Your attendant, a lady who has been paid to keep you fed and forgotten, enters. She is neither a governess nor a nurse. She stays away from your eyes, those characteristic almond-shaped eyes that identify you as something that shouldn't be in a lineage that professes divine appointment as something that is odd and incorrect. She puts down a bowl of cold porridge and backs off. Never, ever say a word. Outside, your relatives practice dancing and diplomacy and study Latin and philosophy. You spend hours watching the dust motes dance in the one beam of light in this room, because it's all you have. Prior to delving into these lost tales of adversity and survival, consider clicking the like button and subscribing for more posts like this if you like, discovering the little-known facts about the past. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. Children whose presence threatened everything their family believed about. Divine right and pure blood resided in the great palaces of Europe, behind gilded doors and under-painted ceilings, displaying celestial grandeur. These sons and daughters were born with what is now known as Down syndrome, a genetic disorder caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21 that frequently results in heart problems, intellectual difficulties, and unusual facial traits. However, these offspring were viewed as curses, humiliations, or divine retribution for hidden sins in earlier generations, until John Langdon Down described the syndrome in 1866 AD, before anybody knew about chromosomes or genetics. When such infants were born among royal families who based their entire legitimacy on the idea of superior breeding and divine favor, they were presented with an unsolvable problem: accepting their different child as God's will. A peasant family may try to include them in farm life, where even menial activities were valuable. Royalty, however, insisted on precision. Each prince and princess served as living representations of dynastic power, future marriage contracts, and political currency. A youngster who would never understand the intricate dance of international diplomacy, who may drool during state dinners, and who was incapable of learning court etiquette. Such a youngster endangered political stability as well as family pride. Take the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, Prince John of the United Kingdom. Born at the Sandringham Estates, York Cottage in 1905 AD, John spent his first 4 years of life like any other royal child, presented to visiting guests. He was photographed among his brothers wearing sailor outfits. However, the seizures started at age 4. Epilepsy was accompanied by symptoms that doctors discreetly identified as learning disabilities and characteristics that historical photos show are typical of Down syndrome. However, this was never formally verified. John had completely disappeared from public life by 1909 AD. In her diary, Queen Alexandra, his grandmother, described seeing Johnny, who had been moved with his loyal nurse, Charlotte Lala Bill, at Wood Farm, a farmhouse on the Sandringham estate. Alexandra told the story of a child who was happy with the little things, like gathering acorns, watching the gardener at work, and laughing at games that only he could understand. They dissuaded his siblings from coming. His parents kept their distance from him, seeing him more as a matter of obligation than love. Following a severe seizure, John passed away at the age of 13 in 1919. Queen Mary wrote to a friend that the child's death was a relief and possibly the greatest mercy for the poor young soul. Centuries of royal communication about such youngsters repeat such words as mercy and release. They expose a world view in which failure to achieve dynastic obligations meant that a life was not worth living, and where diversity equated to pain. However, we occasionally catch a glimpse of humanity emerging between the lines of these meticulously crafted letters. Every sketch, picture, and trinket La John gathered was preserved by his nurse. She took her memories of a youngster who loved music and animals with her when he passed away and was peacefully pensioned off. Recollections that gave a far different picture than the official account of relief and sadness. Returned to France in 1640 AD, when rumors circulated around the Fontainebleau Palace about a child born to King Louis XVI and Anne of Austria. This child was born before the future son, King Louis XVI. Only a weak infant who did not flourish is mentioned in the meticulous Lessonite court papers. However, we now recognize the qualities described in confidential letters between royal physicians that were found in the Vatican's secret archives centuries later. The tongue sticking out, the single palmar wrinkle, and the flat nasal bridge. That unidentified prince lived for precisely 43 days. During repeated interrogations, his wet nurse vowed to feed him correctly and to have done nothing improper. She had done nothing wrong, of course. The heart abnormalities that almost half of all babies with Down syndrome have are probably present in this child. However, in a time when infant mortality necessitated assigning blame and royal blood was thought to be superior to common stock, someone had to be at fault. The specific prayers that Anne of Austria had commissioned were talked about by palace servants. Her visits to shrines in search of an explanation for God's marking of her child. Some claimed it was retribution for the king's transgressions. Some pointed the finger at the queen's Spanish ancestry. Others suggested that astronomical alignments were present at the time of conception. Nobody mentioned or even ventured to insinuate that nature occasionally merely produces variation, that this youngster was just different, not a punishment or a curse. It would take generations for such thinking to evolve. The Roman dynasty in Russia had to deal with its own secret embarrassments. Few people are aware of Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich's youngest daughter, who was born in 1882 AD. Although history remembers Alexa Hemophilia, she is only identified as an infant daughter, and if she died at all, her name is not listed. in any official genealogies. However, Alexander Palace payroll records revealed that for 16 years, following her birth long after an infant's death would necessitate such kara, certain group of servants assigned to the East Wing nursery received consistent income. According to letters sent among women in waiting, a girl who never learned to speak correctly continued to play with toddler-sized dolls at the age of 14, requiring constant supervision to prevent her from wandering into the icy gardens while wearing her nightgown and giggling at snowflakes. Why did this forgotten grand princess just disappear from history when the 1917 AD revolution came? Was she discovered in the East Wing nursery by revolutionary soldiers? This girl who was unable to comprehend the reason behind everyone's yelling. Did a servant entice her away, maybe to a secluded village where a doll-loving, simple-minded woman may go unnoticed? Or did the family decide for themselves who could and could not be saved as they ran for their lives? We will never be able to know. Inconvenient truths and the regimes that produced them are often erased by revolution. Already notorious for their inbreeding, Spain's Habsburg family produced a large number of offspring with a variety of impairments. It is commonly known that Charles II was El Caso, the bewitched. He could hardly chew due to his prominent Habsburg jaw. He didn't speak till he was 4 years old due to his weak mental capabilities. However, Charles's siblings and relatives were never named or given titles, and they were never included in the official portraits. Spanish court physicians recorded newborns born with Mongol features using language that would not be as medical for another 2 centuries, and they encoded Latin that they thought would survive. These doctors saw that the number of these newborns rose with every generation of funkelness unions, cousin marriages, and last-ditch efforts to preserve the purity of royal blood. In 1693 AD, a doctor named Diego Mateo Zapata wrote about seeing a princess whose name was physically erased off the record. In addition to her significant developmental deficits, swallowing difficulties, and diminutive size, he saw something more. Her unwavering love, her wish to embrace everyone she encountered, and her unadulterated delight in dancing and singing, despite her inability to keep time. The Inquisition eventually burnt Zapata for speculating that these kids might not be cursed, but rather just manifestations of God's enigmatic diversity. It wasn't until 1954 AD that his notes, concealed in a fake bottom of a medical text, were found. Although the laws were different in the Ottoman Empire, comparable tragedies occurred. According to reports, Sultan Mehmed III, who ruled from 1595 to 1603 AD, had a son who was born with unusual traits and delayed growth. The laws of Ottoman succession were harsh. Any hint of weakness meant definite extermination as princes battled to the death for the crown. Contrary to what the archives say, this unidentified prince did not perish in infancy. Rather, he was taken to the cafes, the cage, and the Topkapi Palace, a lavish prison where prospective heirs were held in seclusion. Food and supplies were supplied to a designated room at the cafes for 23 years following the alleged death of this prince. According to eunuch documents, guards reported hearing weird noises, including laughter at odd hours and the repetitive singing of the same songs, rather than the typical protests or plotting of imprisoned princes. Every room in the cafes was open to accommodate all possible heirs, when Sultan Ahmed I passed away in 1617 AD, and a guard's memoir, written decades later, claims that one room contained an adult man with a childlike mind surrounded by thousands of pieces of colored glass arranged in elaborate patterns on the floor. He had lived a life that no one would ever recognize, made art that no one would ever see, and hummed tunes that no one would ever hear. What transpired with him during that discovery moment? Records end. There is silence. Another ghost within the confines of the palace. Additional evidence of Bavaria's hidden children can be found in Thut, maybe because eccentricity became practically popular under Mad King Ludwig I at Nymphenburg Palace. His cousin, Princess Alexandra, who was born in 1826 AD, was housed in what the servants referred to as the Quiet Wing. According to official biographies, she passed away at the age of 3. Although household records indicate that she was cared for until 1851 AD, teaching a 25-year-old lady fundamental skills, including how to clothe herself, how to use a spoon properly, and how to recognize letters, though she would never form words described in a governess notebook that was submitted to the Bavarian State Library in 1923 AD with surprising sensitivity. This governess described Alexandra's affection for her pet canaries and how she would spend hours listening to them sing, completely happy in a world that only needed her to exist. However, there were restrictions on even this relative compassion. Alexandra could not be seen, but she could live. She might be real, but not as a princess, or as someone whose name was listed in any succession records. Her body was discreetly buried in an unmarked area of the royal crypt when she passed away. No announcement, no ceremony, as if only acting, as though they never occurred, could erase 25 years of living. When King John V court's infant daughter, Maria Francisca, was born in Portugal in 1734 AD, the Banza family faced its own difficulty. As is customary for royal births, painters were promptly hired to produce her official portrait. However, the portrait was never finished. After his sketches were torched and his commission went unpaid, artist John Rank unexpectedly fled Portugal. When Rank was dying in Madrid years later, he confided in a priest about the baby princess, whose face he was unable to depict in a way that would please the monarch. He allegedly questioned, "How do you paint innocence itself, when innocence is not what power demands?" Maria Francisca was hidden in the Lisbon convent of Santos Anov until she was 11 years old. She enjoyed assisting with simple activities, such as feeding the convent's folding gueltar cloths and singing along to prayers, even though she never learned the words, according to the documents left by the nuns who looked after her. The nuns asked for permission to bury Mary in their cemetery, instead of giving her body back to the royal family when she contracted a fever in 1745 AD. Instantly, almost excitedly, permission was given. Regardless, Denmark's royal family used a different tactic with Prince Gustav. Born in 1803 AD to Frederick V, 6th, her tomb plaque simply reads, "Godchild." No name, no dates, no connection to the throne she could never have inherited. Instead of totally concealing him, they made up a complex lie. They said Gustav had a neurological disorder that needed frequent travel to keep him well. In actuality, he was transferred every few months to distant royal estates, never remaining long enough for the local populace to observe his distinctions. while teaching him fundamental life skills. His tutors, who were actually minders, submitted fictitious reports regarding his academic progress. These tutors' letters, which are kept in the Danish royal archives, show how difficult it was for them to keep up the facade while growing to love their charge. Hans Eriksson, one of Gustav's tutors, wrote a great deal about his extraordinary skills, including his capacity to remember every person he had ever met, his ability to foresee weather changes days in advance, and his peculiar talent for spotting dishonesty. The Danish court did not embrace Eriksson's progressive ideas, despite Euriken's observation that we measure intelligence too narrowly. The prince understands things I do not, and sees patterns I cannot perceive. Who truly has the deficit, him, or those of us who cannot enter his world? At the age of 31, Gustav passed away in Italy while undergoing medical treatment. Although his cause of death was officially pneumonia, it was most likely a heart disease common in people with Down syndrome. At night, his body was brought back to Denmark and interred before daybreak. In the royal genealogy, his whole life was condensed onto one line, being relatively new to royalty. Prince Gustav of Sweden's Bernadette dynasty may have been expected to approach diversity with a more contemporary mindset. They adopted the same strategy as previous dynasties. However, when Prince Carlos was born in 1852 AD, with obvious developmental impairments, he passed away at 3 months old, according to official records. Unofficial documents, witness accounts from servants, medical bills, and food requests indicate that he resided in Tolgan Palace, 30 miles outside Stockholm, until he was at least 9 years old. In his later years, a groundskeeper's son, writing memoirs, recalled playing in the palace gardens with an odd youngster who was mute but never stopped laughing, who had no fear of anything or anyone, and who would spend hours staring at ant colonies. Decades later, it was discovered that this youngster, the groundskeeper's son, only showed up when the royal family wasn't there and vanished a few days before they returned. According to the narrative, he was like a ghost, but the happiest kind of ghost. The Habsburg curse of inbreeding resulted in a large number of disabled infants in Austria-Hungary. In 1868 AD, Archduke Karl Ludwig, the brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, gave birth to a baby who was pronounced dead at birth. However, a different account is told by a midwife's diary that was found during World War II while her family fled bombardment. She wrote that although the infant survived, his features caused the emperor to shudder. The baby was taken from his mother within hours after his delivery, and she was informed that he had passed away. The midwife received a high salary, was sworn to secrecy, and was informed that breaching her word would result in her death. When the same midwife was called to treat a sick boy at a convent outside of Vienna years later, she recognized him right away. She discovered that the monks had been compensated to raise him as an orphan without him ever knowing who he really was. Despite his restrictions, he exuded joy, so they called him Felix, which means glad. For 12 years, he lived with them, helping with everyday chores that the brothers adored. The entire monastery was in mourning when he passed away in 1880 AD from scarlet fever. These hidden children existed in every European royal house. Their stories follow depressingly similar patterns: birth, recognition of difference, concealment, and erasure. Yet occasionally cracks in the official narrative reveal unexpected tenderness. Prussia's Prince Valdemar, born in 1889 AD to Wilhelm II's sister, was hidden away like all the others. The abbot wrote, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could." However, Emma Muller, his nurse, paid a local artist to paint his image on his birthday each year. The boy's unique features are depicted, with dignity and care, in a total of 17 photographs that show him maturing into a man. Emma attempted to offer his mother these portraits after he passed away in 1906 AD. They were torched in front of her after being rejected. Ash replaced the last trace of Valdemar's presence. Emma tried to recount Valdemar's tale in her letters to newspapers for the rest of her life, but no publication would publish them. After she passed away, those letters were discovered among her possessions. Imagine a young man who loved trains, who knew the song of every bird, and who, with just one listen, she wrote again and again that he was not less than, he was different, and in God's view, being different is not a bad thing. Was born in 1879 AD, in contrast to other royal families who kept their offspring hidden entirely. She was described to the public as fragile and incapable of withstanding lengthy rituals. In actuality, she received meticulous coaching for weeks before every performance, instructed to grin, wave, and remain motionless for a predetermined number of seconds before being taken away. Giovanna led a more comprehensive existence behind the palace gates than many of her contemporaries. Her tutors emphasized her strengths, such as her remarkable musical memory, her capacity for repetition learning, and her aptitude for animal comprehension. Her funeral was modest but private when she passed away at the age of 33. However, Italy's relative progressivism was the exception, with her uncle, King Alberto I, reportedly stating, "She lived as God made her, and that was enough." Known for his ruthless exploitation of the Congo, King Leopold II of Belgium showed no mercy to his own deformed daughter, an unnamed sister whose room in the palace was eventually completely shut off. In the 1920s, historians interviewed palace servants who claimed to have heard a child's voice for years, singing silly melodies and pleading for a mother who never arrived, coming from behind those walls, in order to get food and small toys. Through a hole in the walled-off area, one servant, Marie de Lacca, risked her position. According to her testimony, the child whose name she never found out would push drawings back through the same opening. "Mama," he handed the interviewing historian one of Marie's drawings, a sheet of paper with handprints on it that looked like they were created with berry juice. Carefully made hearts encircle each print. The principles of royal humiliation were swiftly learned by Romania's royal family. Son in 1893 AD, who had clear impairments. However, this rasure was unacceptable to Queen Elizabeth, was a topic she wrote about often in her private writings. These obviously coded writings mention going to see his star every night, which is probably a reference to the actual location where the child was housed. Records from a Romanian Orthodox monastery from this era reveal a mysterious donor giving large sums of money to care for a unique child of God. There were explicit instructions included with the donations. The child was to receive art supplies and music instruction, be treated with love, and never be physically abused or confined. Him as gently as he had lived, according to the monastery's chronicle. As medical knowledge about Down syndrome advanced in the 20th century, royal family left behind a patchwork of records of marginalized children. In his memoirs, a doctor who cared for Greek royals living in exile in the 1920s described examining an adolescent princess whose existence was entirely unofficial. Although her parents said she was dead, a faithful servant had taken her away, reared her covertly, and only sought medical attention when the girl had pneumonia. After successfully treating her, the doctor was taken aback by the family's reaction. Instead of celebrating their daughter's survival, they promised him $1 million to permanently fix the issue. He declined, left the country, and wondered for decades what had become of the girl who had held his hand and repeatedly referred to him as nice man, the only phrase she knew. For years, there were rumors about Queen Wilhelmina's missing child in the Netherlands. There was just one daughter, Juliana, according to official records, an unannounced birth, and a child who lived in the castle for a short time before disappearing. Years later, the family of a Dutch farmer in Friesland would recite tales of their Dutch daughter, who had been abandoned by enigmatic benefactors who paid for her upbringing but never paid them a visit. The Dutch royal dynasty was strikingly similar to this girl, who lived until 1934 AD. However, nobody dared to make such remarks out loud. The birth of Princess Ragnhild to future King Olaf V in 1912 AD put Norway's monarchy, which had only been independent since 1905 AD, to the test. The princess lived for 3 days. She spent 8 years living in an unofficial medical facility in Switzerland, visited once a month by a noble Norwegian woman who always wore a veil. Records from the institution which the Nazis took in 1940 AD and the Allies later retrieved show a child with mongoloid traits who was affectionate towards everyone and delighted in small pleasures, despite the fact that she most likely passed away from cardiac problems typical of her illness. The influenza pandemic was blamed for her 1920 AD death, despite the fact that these tales span ages and kingdoms. Disturbing tendencies show up: erasure, shame, dread, secrecy, royal blood that wasn't royal enough, and human variation undermining divine right, the exact traits that make persons with Down syndrome so incredibly happy, affectionate, and devoid of the pretenses that plague normal people. These characteristics ran against the hierarchical, competitive, and tightly regulated bloodline-based royal power structures. However, there are glimmers of humanity hidden between the lines of official denials and erased documents. Servants who went to great lengths to be kind, nurses who preserved sketches and photos where others saw shame, monks and nuns saw holiness. Even some royal parents managed to provide some level of comfort and care for their concealed children, in spite of the demands of their position. Take Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, who was born to Crown Prince Wilhelm in 1915 AD. In contrast to previous generations, her parents did not declare her dead. Rather, they sent her to a special school where she was taught according to her aptitudes. She acquired the ability to write her name, read simple texts, and play the piano enthusiastically but poorly. Her family was presented with a difficult decision when the Nazis took control and started their euthanasia programs that targeted those with disabilities. After outliving the empire she was meant to inherit, records indicate she was discreetly relocated to Switzerland. World War II was a turning moment. Even royal families who had concealed handicapped children for ages, were startled by the Nazis' systematic execution of deformed people, including those with Down syndrome. Some acknowledged their own role in fostering the mindset that allowed for such slaughter. Others merely got more cautious about hiding things, realizing that private humiliation was better than public awareness in a society. Royal attitudes started to gradually change as Europe recovered, and after the war, when Prince John of Luxembourg was born with Down syndrome in 1957 AD, his family took a radical step. Care facility, and the fact that he was their brother and son break in generations of total denial. Due to advancements in medicine, children with Down syndrome were living longer and in better condition. By the 1960s and 1970s, royal families could no longer assert that these children would unavoidably pass away in infancy. Some started covertly lending their support to groups that assisted families with children with disabilities, hardly ever revealing the reasons behind their involvement. Others carried on with traditional methods, but with contemporary effectiveness. Medical records that disappeared into private archives, private institutions in secret locations, and trust funds that guaranteed confidentiality. When the contemporary Spanish royal family openly admitted in 1973 AD that King Juan Carlos's nephew had Down syndrome, they completely broke with convention. The child was spoken to with love rather than embarrassment, was featured in family photos, and went to several public gatherings. It was groundbreaking. However, it brought to light how recently these kids had been denied such fundamental human recognition. We now understand that Down syndrome is merely a genetic variation that affects approximately 1 in every 700 births in all lineages, social groups, and populations. We are aware that people with Down syndrome are capable of leading fulfilling lives, that they feel the same spectrum of emotions as everyone else, and that their intellectual limitations do not lessen their humanity. For ages, royal dynasties that asserted divine appointment and used alleged genetic superiority to defend their position of authority were unable to afford to discover this. Though usually with greater empathy than their forebears, contemporary royal dynasties nonetheless deal with similar issues. Palace PR staff make cautious remarks on privacy and family issues when there are rumors of a royal child with special needs. Although care and support are given, complete integration into royal life is still uncommon. The expectation on royal offspring to be flawless, or at least seem flawless, endures because old habits die hard. According to some historians, the systematic denial of humanity to the most vulnerable members of a monarchy is exemplified by these concealed children. Others point out that royal families were products of their era, adhering to social and medical norms that suggest and branded such youngsters as mongoloid morons. Both viewpoints are accurate. Prejudices against people with disabilities were not created by royal families, but because of their positions of authority, they are particularly accountable for their continuation. Investigating these tales reveals an archive of absence, destroyed documents, names scratched out, painted over portraits, and unmarked or relocated cemeteries. How many cases did not leave any trace for every one that was documented? How many royal children with Down syndrome were only known to a select group of servants under oath? How many of them died thinking they were orphans, unaware that their parents parents were still having children in a palace who were more suited to the royal standard. The cost of the secrecy to all parties concerned, however, may be more devastating than the secrecy itself. Instead of loving their children, parents came to view them as embarrassing secrets. Instead, they grew up thinking in their own genetic superiority, which prevented siblings from developing empathy and understanding. The hidden children themselves lead diminished lives in the shadows, where they could have flourished with the right encouragement and acceptance. These historical figures lacked the instruments that modern medicine has provided. Now that Down syndrome may be identified prenatally, there are more complicated but distinct moral decisions to be made. This history of absence is further compounded by the fact that some royal families have probably ended pregnancies after getting such a diagnosis. Others, albeit rarely in the spotlight, have made the decision to carry on with pregnancies and raise disabled children, although there are still rumors of more recent cases handled with utmost delicacy. The last known instance of a European royal child with Down syndrome being kept totally secret from the public was in the 1960s, perhaps as it should be. Privacy, regulations, and contemporary medical ethics make it more difficult to follow such stories. Notoriety, but solitude for these kids. They should not be imprisoned. They should be protected. How could history have changed if these kids had received recognition? If the Spanish Habsburgs had realized that their pure bloodline created as much diversity as any peasant family, and if Prince John had stood by his brother, Edward VIII, throughout the abdication crisis, it would be impossible to change history, restore names to scratched-out documents, or mark lost graves if a single royal family had declared, somewhere in those centuries of denial, "This is our child, different but beloved, and we will not hide them." Despite their incapacity to inherit thrones or form alliances, we can acknowledge the existence of these forgotten princes and princesses, their significance, and the worth of their lives. They were kids who experienced the world in ways their typical siblings could never, who cried and smiled, and who felt love and loneliness. Despite their situation, some people managed to find moments of happiness. Prince Gustav forecasting the weather, Felix providing joy to his monastery, and the anonymous Russian Grand Duchess arranging her glass pieces from the perspective of those who ought to have protected them. Some probably led lives of extreme neglect and loneliness, knowing only that they were somehow flawed, ashamed, or less than human. Their experiences make us face hard realities about how society views diversity, how hierarchies of power uphold limited notions of value, and how shame is inherited in a perverse way. The way royal families treated children with disabilities served as a window into the worst aspects of society. The wish to conceal flaws, eradicate difference, and act as though human variation is an anomaly rather than a natural law. In the environment that today's royal families live in, disability rights movements have altered public perceptions, and inclusion is prized, at least in theory, if not often in reality. However, the spirits of those children who were hidden still haunt royal hallways and unmarked graves, serving as a reminder that wealth and status do not always translate into empathy. Any blood can run as cold as that blue blood. Imagine that child once more, watching the dust motes dance in the dawn light in the Habsburg Tower. They may have gone by Ferdinand, France, Maria, or thousands of other names that we will never know. They endured shame that wasn't theirs, and they lived and died in it, victims of a mentality that was intolerant of diversity, couldn't appreciate beauty and diversity, couldn't see that their family's lack of compassion, rather than their extra chromosome, was the real deficiency. The youngster returns to watching light and shadow play across ancient walls as their carer departs, their footsteps fading down stone halls, unaware that their plight is shared by hundreds of others around Europe. Not quite enough royal blood. They hum a song that no one else will ever hear, a divine appointment undercut by human reality. Put things in patterns that only they can understand, and look forward to tomorrow's silent attendant, tomorrow's bowl of cold porridge, and tomorrow's brief bursts of filtered sunlight in a room that the outside world pretends doesn't exist. Ultimately, we learn more about power than we do about Down syndrome from these forgotten royals. How it corrupts, not only through brutality, but also through humiliation, and not only through ambition, but also through fear. They serve as a reminder that every community has its own shadows, taboo subjects, and vanished members. The way a civilization handles people who don't fit the mode, can't play the game, or reside outside the bounds of acceptable diversity is a better indicator of its level of civilization than its palaces or crown treasures. The bones of princes and princesses whose sole transgression was being born differently rest somewhere in Europe, in unmarked graves and forgotten corners of regal crypts. Their existence was denied, their faces were destroyed, and their names were removed. But they survived. They smiled, they cried, they breathed, and they died, completely human in spite of all efforts to hide it. Additionally, their silence says a lot about what occurs when bloodline becomes more important than blood. You are still in that tower room when appearance takes precedence over reality, and when the fear of imperfection grows more heinous than any perceived flaw. Centuries fell into one moment of desolation. You realize, however, that you are not alone. Others share your fate in castles, convents, institutions, and throughout time and geography. Your name will be forgotten by history. However, you were real, you were important, and that's sufficient in that dawn light that seeps through generations and stone. When authority chooses forgetfulness over the more difficult task of remembering, absence over presence, and shame over love, it must be sufficient because it is all that is left. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nestware. Every night, a new story takes flight.